In this lecture, we'll be discussing the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea from 1945 to 1988. Now, in discussing North Korean history, there's a few things I want to talk about before going into the issue of periodization. And I think this is important for understanding North Korea and how to approach it as a historical subject. So, when I was in high school in Indiana, I think there was a standard that said we had to read at least one dystopian novel. And of course, the two big ones are Brave New World and 1984. And in my class, we read Brave New World. Now, if you've never read Brave New World, it's a fascinating book because, in one sense, it's a dystopia, but it's one in which I think many people wouldn't mind living in. I believe when we discussed it in high school, the teacher actually asked, would you like to live in this dystopia? And I think a lot of students were willing to live in it because in many ways it wasn't that terrible of a place. In contrast, the other dystopian novel is George Orwell's 1984. He wrote it in 1948 and then switched the dates around. So 1948 becomes 1984. And if you've not read 1984, you should. I've read it once. I do not ever plan on reading it again. I think once is enough because it is in many ways just a horrifying description of life in an authoritarian, totalitarian state. And just reading that enough once was enough for me. So it's the kind of book I think you should read. It's a very painful thing to read, but reading it once is sufficient to get the benefit from it. And one thing about 1984 is how seriously it takes history, and this is one reason why I think it's important for historians to know about, because it really shows us the importance of the craft. And here's a wonderful quote: the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history, right? And as historians, it's in a sense our job to remind people of what has actually happened because that is a part of reality, right? Human beings, we live in reality. We need to live in reality. We can't deny that reality. And historians' job is to help us remember that reality. And the reality that George Orwell was writing against was, again, this rise of these totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. And the representative of one of these regimes from 1984 has this to say in the novel in response to the hero. And he says, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. That was the future that George Orwell feared. And I would argue very much that that is the future that has occurred in North Korea, right? And I think that this is a good description of life for the majority of people in North Korea, right? Imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. And another fantastic quote from 1984 is here. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past, right? So whoever's in power now is able to control how we understand the past. And whoever does that is going to decide what's going to happen in the future. Now, in places that are free, such as the United States, such as many European countries, much of East Asia, you can talk about the past. And in a sense, no one person or group controls the past. And that is very important, I think, because it allows us to have a free kind of discussion and for ideas to more or less stand on their own merit, right? You don't have a politician or a dictator deciding, okay, this is what we're going to believe about the past because this is what will benefit me. No, you have historians, professional historians doing their work, checking each other, making sure that what they're saying squares with the historical record, right? And through this, then what this means in a sense is the people of society are in much more control of the past, and if problematic ideas of the past arise, it's possible to challenge them. But in places like North Korea, that is prevented by the government because it realizes that whoever controls the past controls the future. And one thing I think is fascinating about North Korea is in its libraries, they periodically pull old newspapers, right? So they have basically one newspaper, the Nodong Shinmun, which is like the workers' daily, and they publish this newspaper, and it's stored in the library for a while so people can look at back issues, but eventually they pull them because they don't want to see where the government has changed its mind, right? They don't want people to see where it has changed policy. They want to create this myth that the government is always right. And because the government's always right, we should trust and support it and do what it tells us. And I think these other two quotes from George Orwell and from 1984, this guy was just great at quotes, really give us an idea of the reality of North Korea as well. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. Right? In this case, the Korean Workers' Party. And because we control reality, because the party controls reality, controls the past, we can make things that make no sense. Right? We can make statements, slogans, ideas that make no sense. And several slogans that were in 1984 were ignorance is strength, war is peace, freedom is slavery. And this is the kind of thinking that you have in North Korea. And it's enforced by the idea that Big Brother is watching you. Right? There's always someone watching you. There's always someone that keeps you under surveillance. And so it's very difficult to challenge these ideas. And I do not believe this is from 1984. It's just a general Orwell quote. And in it, George Orwell says, the masses never revolt of their own accord, and they never revolt merely because they are oppressed. Indeed, so long as they are not permitted to have standards of comparison, they never even become aware that they are oppressed. And now I do think North Korean people, as they gain a greater understanding of the world around them, do understand that they are oppressed. But there is a lot of truth to this quote, and it's why the North Korean government is obsessed with controlling information. Right? It's obsessed with making sure that people only hear the message that they wanted to hear, because otherwise they may decide to get rid of the whole system. And so North Korea is a country founded on a series of big lies, right? And you can kind of see this, the image of North Korea in this propaganda poster. It says, we will stay forever with our glorious leader, Kim Il-sung. And you have Kim Il-sung, and he's embracing those children there, and he's got these happy people behind him. There is symbols of wealth, you can see, and military power. You can see that woman with that unbelievably large stack of wheat, signifying that people are going to have enough to eat. And there's this belief that they have had this wonderful, great leader whose dynasty, right, his grandson is now in charge of North Korea, is just wonderful. They're amazing, and motivated by the purest of patriotism, they are seeking to protect the Korean people. And this is all just a bunch of lies. Kim Il-sung was in many ways relatively incompetent, I think, in many ways, right? He was wrong about the Korean War. He thought that they could invade and take over quickly, and he was wrong about that, but he managed to eliminate his enemies and stay in power. And he's an example of one of these people who is able to stay in power. They're competent in that sense that they can stay in power. But once they have power, they don't really do anything with it. And rather than being motivated by any kind of pure patriotism, which would, I understand true patriotism is mean your willingness to sacrifice for benefit of the country, the Kim family, the Kim dynasty, has done everything to stay in power, even if it means sacrificing the good of their people, right? If the Kims really cared about the people of North Korea, of the Korean nation, they would immediately resign and help establish unification so that South Korea could help North Korea. But they're not motivated by pure patriotism. They are motivated by a desire to stay in power, and they're willing to hold their own people and the people of South Korea hostage in order to stay in power, right? So we have they and the elites are incredibly self-centered. They claim to be patriotic. They're not. They're unwilling to make even the tiniest sacrifice for the good of the Korean people. But because they're able to control information, they're able to control history, they're able to maintain their position in power and continue oppressing millions of people for their own good. And I have to talk about this in part for a couple of reasons with this class. One is just I think it shows us how important history is, because they've had to create this image by completely falsifying history that Kim Il-sung was actually a good leader in order to maintain their power. And they kept out anything that would conflict with that, anything that would challenge that, right? So it shows the importance of history. It's necessary for us to understand North Korea, that how much of a difference there is between the propaganda and the reality, between how people have to talk and what's actually going on. And if you're going to study North Korea, you have to understand that. And it also just comes to the issue of bias. I really struggle with this section. It's hard. I'm going to be kind of snarky as I do this section, because I just absolutely despise the North Korean government for reasons that I think should be abundantly clear, in which, if they're not, I will hopefully clarify as we go on. And if that's one reason I don't study North Korea, because I just can't help myself. I'm just incredibly annoyed and frustrated. Even making this section, I was just like, these leaders, they drive me nuts, right? Because they're such hypocrites, right? Claiming to be these great leaders who care about the people and the nation, and they're terrible leaders who just use other people as trash, or just do whatever they want to other people in order to advance their own interests. And you don't want to, in a sense, people like me can't study North Korea. And so if you feel this way, probably it's going to be very difficult to do a paper on North Korea if you can't control it, right? I'm going to do my best to control it, to give you as objective as possible picture of North Korea as I can, so you can write a paper on North Korea if that's what you want. But again, this is a warning. If you're trying to do something on North Korea, you really got to be able to control this. So moving on to periodization. Similar with South Korea, we can talk about how there was this division occupation between 1945 and 1950, how the Korean War breaks out in 1950 and lasts until 53. At least that's when they have an armistice. 1953 and 1967 is a period where North Korea is doing really well. This is when North Korea will recover from the war. Remember, North Korea had been devastated by American bombings and will actually industrialize to a great deal. And you'll have a kind of political consolidation. Even though the communists are in charge, there are different understandings of the revolution, about what communism means for North Korea. And I think during this time period, in many ways, we can still talk about North Korea being communist. From 1967 to 1980, however, we have a major shift. And this is often referred to as the monolithic system, which is the term that the North Korean government uses, where basically, whereas before there was a kind of diversity to a certain degree among the different communists that were in North Korea, and there were actual debates and disagreements about policy. From 1967 to 1980, basically you have the growing establishment of a monolithic system focused on the ideas of Kim Il-sung. So he was already kind of a dictator, but he's becoming a totalitarian dictator, certainly during this time period, even suppressing dissent among other party members. And that's also when North Korea increasingly shifts to becoming what we call a dynastic state, in which you have succession from father to son, right? This is really bizarre for communist countries. They don't usually do this. But in North Korea, you have rulership staying within the family. And I think during this time period, it's really fair to say North Korea is not really that communist anymore, and they will eventually eliminate communism from their constitution, right? And I think from 53 to 67, you could fairly say that North Korea is a communist country. From 67 to 80, it's becoming increasingly fascist. But during that time period, if you were in South Korea, in many ways, things were better for the North Koreans than you. During that time period, North Korea was in some ways safer, more orderly, better able to distribute goods evenly. But by the 1980s, certainly, North Korea had gone into a period of stagnation and decline. And that's where we kind of end in 1988, when things are not going well for North Korea, and when it's really clear that South Korea is the place you want to be. And just as an aside, in the periodization here, especially this period 53 to 67, 67 to 80, I'm referring to a wonderful book called North Korea, A History by Michael Seth. And I highly recommend that if you're going to do something on North Korea, you need to read this book. It's not the most exciting thing, but it is an extraordinarily important textbook for understanding North Korea. So North Korea was occupied by the Soviet Union, as we discussed earlier. Now, initially it was bad. The Soviet troops acted really, really badly, were terrorizing the Korean population. but order was very quickly restored. And what is fascinating is that the Soviet Union will very quickly govern through Koreans. And through this, they will build a coalition government that includes communists and non-communists. And this is really good at helping to restore order. And one thing that the Soviet Union had that the Americans did not have was that there were actually a large number of Koreans living in the Soviet Union who spoke Russian and Korean. And those Koreans were very necessary and very helpful in the Soviet Union being able to bring a lot more order and stability initially than the United States was. Remember, the American occupation does not go well in South Korea. The Soviet occupation in North Korea goes very, very well. And they're very quickly able to establish a lot of social order. And this is makes North Korea look a lot better in many ways. Now, of course, one thing that you'll note if you study the history of communism is that usually communists will build these kind of coalition governments with non-communists in order to get order, but will very quickly, when possible, take power completely for themselves. And this was made easier by the fact that there was Soviet troops in North Korea. So while initially you have this kind of coalition government, very quickly the communists will increasingly take power. The Soviet Union will support Kim Il-sung as the prospective leader of the Korean Communist Party, or they called it usually the KWP, the Korea Workers' Party, and a representative for the government as a whole, right? Because they're going to try and establish, and they successfully do this, a communist party state, right? So basically the head of the party and the head of the state are the same thing in essence. And the Soviet Union supports Kim Il-sung for these tasks. It wants him to be their man in Korea. So similar to how the United States is going to turn to Syngman Rhee and support him, the Soviet Union will focus its support on Kim Il-sung. And these images, the one on the left is of him giving his speech in which he is kind of announced as the Soviet Union's, great leader to be in North Korea. And there's a painting on the right in which he is being celebrated. They're basically trying to argue, initially he was welcomed immediately by the Korean people as this great leader. And this is overplaying things, but I do want to point out, the reason that the Soviets picked Kim Il-sung in part was because he was both a communist, but he also had very good anti-Japanese and nationalist credentials. Remember, Kim Il-sung had fought in a guerrilla war against the Japanese. He had done so with, I can't say he was that successful in absolute terms, but relatively speaking, he was successful. He was one of the most successful anti-Japanese guerrilla leaders there was. So he did have some real support. He was, again, like I said, he was a real nationalist in a sense. He was, Koreans support him, and the communists were fine with him because he was a communist. But remember, he also spent time in the Soviet Union, and I believe held the official rank of captain in the Soviet army. So the Soviet Union felt that this was someone that they could also kind of control. And honestly speaking, for the first few years, right, they do control him. So for example, Syngman Rhee, remember he was anti-trusteeship, right? The Americans supported trusteeship. He was anti-trusteeship, and we could not stop him from being anti-trusteeship. Kim Il-sung was initially anti-trusteeship, but then the Soviet Union said, nope, you got to be pro-trusteeship. And so Kim Il-sung flip-flopped and became pro-trusteeship. And remember, trusteeship is referring to this idea that Korea need to be governed as a trustee nation. So basically the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union would govern them until they were ready to be independent. Koreans hated this. Kim Il-sung did not like it initially, but he changed his position because the Soviet Union told him to do. So at first, Kim Il-sung is pretty much a puppet of the Soviet Union, as really reliant on them to kind of advance him as the main leader in North Korea. And as Kim Il-sung and the Communist Party slowly gain absolute power in society, they will increasingly undertake reforms. And one thing I want to stress, and this is something we have to be careful about because it's very easy to become victims of anachronism. We know how the story kind of turns out in North Korea. It's not a nice story. But early on, things are very different. One thing that North Korea did very quickly was to engage in land reform. So they are going to seize land. typically from people who were pro-Japanese as well as the Japanese government. They also seized land from churches and from Buddhist temples and from some of the wealthier people. But their real focus is going to be on the Japanese and pro-Japanese people. And so taking land from the former land holdings of the Japanese government and pro-Japanese Koreans, that's really popular, right? And giving it to the peasants. They will also bring in a lot of improved labor laws. So, for example, people will have, they won't have to, they'll have like an 8-hour workday. There'll be a lot of provisions made for workers' rights. Women will achieve legal equality. And there will be a massive increase in education, especially that kind of basic education, basic literacy, basic ability to read and write, and so forth. And for a lot of progressive intellectuals in Korea, North Korea is the place to be, especially when we compare it with South Korea. Remember, South Korea has a lot of social disorder. They're going to be late having land reform. They don't really make much change in the labor laws. Things just aren't as good in South Korea as they seem to be in North Korea. And if you're a progressive intellectual, this is really attractive, and you're going to go from south to north even. And this happens a lot. And this is one thing to kind of keep in mind as if you look in this time period, that in many ways things look better in the north than they do in the south, right? And especially if you're someone on the political left, they look really good. Now, the Korean War, of course, is launched by North Korea. And this goes back to the whole thing I was talking about like big lies and about how you try and control the past. Because, as we'll talk about later, the Korean War, it's clearly, North Korea just flat out invaded South Korea. But the North Korean soldiers who actually did the invading were told that they had been attacked first and they were responding. And this is the official history. And what this allows North Korea to do is to claim that Kim Il-sung, rather than launching a war that he failed miserably and just killed a bunch of people, right? The war he promised, oh yeah, this will be a quick war, we'll quickly unify the peninsula. The guy should have been fired, right? He should have lost his job as leader because he totally blew it during this war and was not particularly a very good commander even. So he should have lost his job and should not be looked up to as some great leader because he wasn't. However, because it's be presented as North Korea responding to a South Korean attack, rather than being a defeat, it's presented as a victory, because the argument is the evil South Koreans, puppets who are led by the United States, they forced this war upon us, but we defended ourselves and we survived, and that's a victory, right? It's a complete lie. It's completely false. But it allows Kim Il-sung to be portrayed as this great, wonderful leader. I'm not going to go too much into the Korean War here because we did that in the previous lecture, but I just need to note that the Korean War happens, that Kim Il-sung launched it, and that it failed miserably. Now, in 1954, there was a conference called the Geneva Conference, and you may have heard of this, but usually it's in connection to what to do about Vietnam. But Korea was also discussed there, and basically during the armistice, it was decided that at the Geneva Conference they would figure out some way to help build a kind of unification government in Korea. Needless to say, this failed completely, right? And so North Korea and South Korea, not only is there not going to be a peace treaty, but of course they're not going to be unified. And as I had mentioned previously, of course, the Korean War is fought from 1950 to 1953. And it's presented not as a defeat, not as a huge mistake by Kim Il-sung, but as a victorious defense against Western aggression and the Republic of Korea puppet government that is just, like I say, just a puppet of the United States. And Kim Il-sung, not only is he then able to present himself as like this great leader, he says, look, there could be another war, and so we need me to build up our country to make it militarily strong, and you need to all support me. If you don't support me, you're supporting the enemy. And this gives him this really good position so he can deal with all the different factions within the Communist Party. And the factions are connected to different policy understandings, but also those policy understandings are often shaped by where people are originally connected to. So, for example, when North Korea becomes communist, a lot of Korean communists from China come to North Korea. A lot of Korean communists from the Soviet Union come to North Korea. and they kind of have their own understanding of how communism should work based on where they were, where they learned about communism and how they were educated. And so they form different factions within the party. Kim Il-sung is in charge of the guerrilla faction, which is made up of his buddies from the days when he was a guerrilla soldier. And they had different understandings for how they did things. So, for example, the Korean communists who were educated in the Soviet Union tended to focus on the idea of using technology to develop, which would have been a good idea. However, what's going to happen is, based on this kind of wartime situation, these fears of a possible future war, Kim Il-sung is able to gradually eliminate every faction within the Communist Party other than his own. He does this by 1967, right? That's the year of the last major purge that he launches, and basically gets rid of every single possible challenger. Now, I want to stress how ruthless in a sense this is, because these are fellow communists that they're arresting, torturing, and executing. Right? These are their fellow communists. Not only, I mean, these are, and their fellow Korean communists, right? So, and this is in many ways just to make the Kim family stronger, or at least to cement Kim Il-sung's position, right? But basically, because North Korea, there's always this ever-present threat of war, something that the government plays on a lot, and that allows them to justify going harshly after their enemies and treating any kind of disagreement as treason. And like I said, this allows for the successful elimination of basically all opposition by 1967. So Kim Il-sung and the guerrilla faction will remain supreme. So the government makes particular promises to the North Korean people, and this has to do, in a sense, with the public image it presents. And so you need to understand this public image if you want to understand what's going on in North Korea and understand the history, but also I have to stress how there's some problems with it. But again, when you think about North Korea, it's important not to think that much about communism. They don't even mention it in their constitution anymore. It's better to think about nationalism and peasant worker prosperity. Those were the promises that were made. So, for example, North Korea officially emphasizes nationalism. Now, I say theoretically here and officially because I would argue the North Korean regime is not dominated by nationalism. It's dominated by regime survival and taking care of the elite, and who cares what happens to the rest of the Korean people. And that's not how nationalists think. Nationalists are willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of the nation. The North Korean elite are completely unwilling to do that. If they did, they would figure out a way to unify with South Korea, even giving up their power to do so. The fact that they don't shows that they don't really care. But in any case, in terms of public rhetoric, the North Korean government emphasizes nationalism. And the main principle of nationalism, of course, is that each nation should have its own state and only one state. So it wants to achieve unification, meaning it wants to govern the whole Korean peninsula, right? It wants to govern the whole Korean peninsula. Wants to get rid of the Republic of Korea, which it argues is basically a puppet government dominated by the United States. I hope I've shown in this last lecture, the previous lecture, that's just false. The United States does not dominate South Korea. We never did. We never could. But in any case, that's what they tell their people, that the Americans dominate South Korea. And the South Koreans actually would love to live under North Korean rule if they just could, if the Americans would just leave. So there's this emphasis on achieving unification, but at least, at the very least, defending North Korea, so at least there's some independent Korean state. There's also this emphasis originally that all would work for the state and receive a basic living. This was guaranteed through something called the public distribution system. And North Korea got the closest of any communist country to actually completely controlling the economy and eliminating money. They didn't succeed, and now this whole system has broken down, and North Koreans are pretty much on their own. The government doesn't do much to actually help them. But even then, they didn't even promise that much. Kim Il-sung's promise was that they would become wealthy enough that they could eat boiled rice and meat soup, dress in silk, and live in houses with tile roofs. Koreans had traditionally lived in thatched roof houses. You don't want to live in a thatched roof house. They look very nice and romantic, but in the thatch roofing, there's like rats and other animals live there, and they leak when it rains. So you want to live in a tile roof if you can. But this is a very minor promise, and the North Korean government has not been able to keep it. But they just blame foreigners and say, well, it's those Americans' fault. It's the imperialists' fault. That's why things are not like they should be right? And remember, going back to that George Orwell quote, the party is always right? The party is always correct, right? So it's not our fault that we don't have enough food to eat. It's those Americans' fault. And again, that's something that's very important to understand if you're looking at North Korea, is there's this almost complete inability to admit that anyone in the party ever, especially high-ranking party members, ever made any mistake, and certainly not anyone in the Kim family. Now, with North Korea, it's always difficult to get accurate statistics, and I have to kind of struggle to deal with that. I'm going to give you a couple statistics, but just know that these could be off because we're always trying to guess with North Korea. They try and hide their weaknesses and are always want to exaggerate their accomplishments. But even if the numbers aren't completely right, one thing we do know is that after the Korean War, North Korea effectively mobilized its population to rebuild industry. They had these mass mobilization projects where they would get a lot of people together and build a reservoir or build a dam or build a road or build a bridge or something like that. And because they were so effective at mobilizing the population, authoritarian governments can be good at that, their industrial output is recovered much more quickly from the Korean War than South Korea, right? So remember, we talked about how Syngman Rhee, the economy in South Korea is just terrible during this time period under his government. And the South Korean government was just almost entirely dependent on American aid, especially for its military. I mean, it was just terrible economic situation. If you contrast that with North Korea, in 1954, it was relying on a third of its government revenue coming from foreign aid. But by 1960, right, remember that's the year that Syngman Rhee is overthrown in the South, it's only 2.6%. Now, there were some ways that this is kind of exaggerated, but I have to emphasize things are going better in North Korea than South Korea during this time. The economy is growing, it's developing, right? Now, there's a problem, though, in the focus of the economic development, right? The emphasis is on heavy industry and the military. Little attention is being paid to consumer goods. And this is because the goals of the economy is to defend North Korea, right? There's a memory of this war that did not go well for North Korea and where North Korea was bombed and suffered a lot. Of course, there's also memory of the colonization by Japan. They don't want that to happen again. And of course, if things go really well, they hope to unify the peninsula. And especially in the time period we're talking about, and I can't emphasize this enough, and it's because things are so bad now in North Korea. Through the time period we're talking about, North Korea was often economically better off than South Korea and had a military that was as good or, in many ways, better than South Korea. So North Korea posed a real military threat to South Korea. And North Koreans could realistically dream of a day when, if things went right for them, they could unify with South Korea by force, right? So I have to stress that, right? Now, we shouldn't be surprised by these goals and this emphasis because North Korea is dominated by guerrillas. But there is, of course, and if they would have been able to unify us with South Korea very quickly, this wouldn't maybe have been such a big deal. But the problem is, this just isn't good for your long-term economy. You need to have consumer goods, right? And having a strong military, that could be resources that could be invested in other products that would, and infrastructure and things like that, that would help your society develop. But it just doesn't, North Korea is not going to follow that idea. And part of it's because they're dominated by these soldiers who see every solution as war. So one thing we have to say about North Korea, I've emphasized how Korea was traditionally a poor country. North Korea was especially poor, particularly in terms of agriculture. In mineral wealth, it's actually got a lot. But in terms of agriculture, things are not good in North Korea, in a large part because of the climate. It's very cold there. So that was not the farming center of traditional Korea. And this is one of the tragedies, in a sense, of division, is that North and South Korea really need each other. There's all this wonderful mineral wealth in the North, hydroelectric power, things like that. It's really good for industry. In the South, that's where all the good rice land is. So it's kind of, this is where, the two halves really need each other. But in any case, North Korea, even from the beginning, has problems getting enough food, right? Now, they did engage in land reform, and that made them popular among the farmers. However, And this is where I always get frustrated dealing with communists, because one thing you'll note about communists, this is my bias, but this is also, I think, correct, is they promise the peasants land reform. They say, if you support us, we will give you land. The peasants support them. They win. They get control of the government. They give the peasants land. And then when they can, they take the land back. And that's exactly what happened in China. It's what happened in North Korea, right? So the Korean farmers were given land. However, then, starting in 1953, the North Korean government started what's called collectivization. And basically, in a collective, you take the land and the government owns the land and controls the land, and the farmers merely become laborers on the land, right? So farmers go from being owner cultivators to basically farm laborers who are working for the government. And the big difference is when you're a farmer, you work hard, you grow food, you can sell the surplus and do with that money what you want. But when you have collectivization, you're just working for a wage, and the government just decides, yeah, you did this much work, this is how much food you get, we get the rest. By 1956, they had claimed that 40% of farmers were on collectives. By 1958, they claimed all. Now, the government did this because it allowed the government to control farmers and their produce, right, and use the food how they want. They use it to reward the elites, which is this bizarre situation where you have like farmers starving to death. But the problem is this leads to a decline in productivity. Another kind of problem too is that agricultural labor will be pulled for building products and industrialization. And one thing that's just bizarre about dealing with North Korea is we have to remember you had these guys who were soldiers in charge, especially after 1967, and they were guerrilla soldiers, so they didn't really understand much about technology. And they just didn't understand basic economics. Like, they didn't understand that if you have a farmer and you take him off of his farm to work in a mine or to build a road, he's no longer working on his farm. And so you're not going to get as much food, right? They never seemed to really understand this. And they would try and just do way too much economically. Like, they would try and have massive agricultural, industrial, and military development all at once. And they would fail to have any development, basically. Now, during much of our time period, a lot of these problems were made up for with things like chemical fertilizers. North Korea was receiving aid from the Soviet Union in particular, and a lot of the aid was in the form of fertilizer. And this allowed them to be able to get as much to make up for these problems and to give their people at least a decent amount of food. Now, from our perspective, this all sounds really bad, and I would argue it is particularly bad for the soldiers, for the farmers. But one thing I have to emphasize, for Koreans who lived through the colonial period, this was an improvement, right? So if you were a Korean who lived through the colonial period, you maybe didn't like all this stuff, but your life was actually better in many ways than it had been under the Japanese. And so what we also have to understand, I think in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, there were among many North Korean people a belief that their country was on the right path and real support for the government, right? Again, that's kind of hard maybe to accept because we know what's kind of happening now. But much of this, and as much as I've criticized, there was real development, and development that in many ways was ahead of what was happening in South Korea. So there was real popular support for the government in many respects, I think at least up until the 70s and into the 80s, during the period we're talking about. So as we discussed before, there's this cementing of power under Kim Il-sung that really is, it's going on for a long time, but 1967, you'll remember, is this year where you have him eliminating basically all the other factions. And if we want to be charitable towards Kim Il-sung, and I find that very difficult to do, but as a historian, I have to try, it seems that he perhaps believed that it was necessary in order to unify Korea that the communists in North Korea, still basically communists at this point, also had to be unified. Giving him the benefit of the doubt, it seems that perhaps he thought that in order for unification of the whole country to take place, he had to make sure North Korea was completely unified. It just so happens, of course, that this dovetails very nicely with his own self-interest because it meant crushing all opposition. And I think if he really cared, he could have figured out some other way of unifying the country that didn't involve executing his other fellow communist colleagues. But in any case. And this process, once he's eliminated these other factions by 1967, he can really advance things. And by 1974, there is the establishment of what are called the 10 principles for the establishment of the monolithic system. Not the most exciting thing to read, but it is very important. And I'm just going to quote one of the 10 principles, Principle 4. We must make great leader Comrade Kim Il-sung's revolutionary ideology our faith and his instructions our creed. And I think it's interesting how there's these kind of religious elements here. And he's almost divinized, and his teachings made into kind of sacred scripture in a sense. But this monolithic system is meant to focus everything on the leader, Kim Il-sung, who is, by the way, still president of North Korea. He is the eternal president. No one else can be president now. They just have other leadership positions that Kim Jong-un fills. And the focus must be on everything and on his family. So it's really in this time period that we see North Korea especially moving increasingly away from communism towards a kind of fascist system of charismatic leadership, where the leader is credited with everything.